Make no mistake about it, the Jets may have hired Brian Duker as their defensive coordinator, but this is now Aaron Glenn's defense from top to bottom. Locked On Jets starts now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, January 29th, 2026, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. A big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and today's episode is sponsored by Prize Picks. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. On today's show, we are talking about coaching news for the New York Jets. The team has interviewed 5 offensive coordinator candidates for the vacant job that Tanner Engstrand left open. We'll talk about and break down who these candidates are. We'll discuss why the Jets' struggles are not all Aaron Glenn's fault. There are organizational issues that are contributing to the issues that this team has. But we will begin by talking about a major hire. The Jets have announced that they have hired Brian Duker as their new defensive coordinator. Duker spent the last 2 seasons with the division rival Miami Dolphins as their secondary coach and pass game coordinator. Prior to that, he spent 3 years on the Detroit Lions defensive coaching staff working under Aaron Glenn. Duker is not a guy with a ton of experience. He started in the NFL as a coach back in 2015 with the Browns as an intern. He then had some low-level jobs up until he was hired by the Detroit Lions in 2021 as a defensive assistant, then was promoted to safeties coach, became coach for all defensive backs in 2023 before going to Miami. This was a surprise. His name was not on the list of 8 candidates the Jets put out a couple of weeks ago. This apparently moved very fast. There were reports that Duker interviewed virtually on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, he was hired. It took one virtual interview for him to be hired. Now, I think anybody who has a strong opinion on how Duker will do as defensive coordinator is doing a lot of guesswork because there's just not a big resume. If you're a Jets fan, you can hope he's the next great defensive mind in the NFL. And maybe he is. But if you've been troubled by this Jets offseason, I don't think what we've seen through this process is going to alleviate your concern, because while Duker could be great, there's nothing really inherent in his resume that suggests he's up for this job. I mean, my view is that the Jets need a shock to their system. The Jets need to bring in some big time assistant coaches to try and turn this thing around, because this is a monumental task in front of this coaching staff, trying to turn this team around. Now, hopefully the Jets will bring in some better players. You got to hope the personnel will improve, and quite a bit. Be tough for it to get worse, but Jets need a lot of work. And to bring in a guy with so little experience and ask him to play a major role in turning this around, it feels like a lot to ask. I think you have to ask why this process played out as it did. The Jets had a defensive coordinator opening for over 6 weeks. Now, to be fair, they couldn't really interview anybody until the regular season was over, but that was 3.5 weeks ago. This process dragged on for 3.5 weeks. And then suddenly you bring in somebody out of the blue and you hire him. It's really tough to figure, especially somebody with the background of Brian Duker. Again, I don't want to be overly negative on him before he's had a chance to coach a practice, but the whole scenario is just very odd to me. Now, look, there was not going to be a Vic Fangio out there. There was not going to be a Steve Spagnuolo out there. There was not going to be that sort of big time candidate who was willing to come to the Jets, because this is a very chaotic situation. But if you're asking me, am I more confident in the Jets defense today than I was yesterday? I think the answer is no. And it's a pretty resounding no. Now, it sounds like Aaron Glenn's going to take over the defensive play calling. That's been reported fairly widely. I guess when you hire a coordinator with so little experience and without any play calling experience, that was natural. And it just kind of feels like out of nowhere, Aaron Glenn has done this 180, because last year through the offseason and even into the season, he commented on many occasions that he did not want to be distracted by play calling, that he wanted to be able to evaluate the whole team, that he wanted to be the guy who was in charge. And now it's like we've completely changed course. And depending on whether you believe certain reports or not, it sounds like he just kind of did a 180 during the interview process for defensive coordinators. It sounded like originally he wanted to bring in someone who would call plays. And then at the last minute, suddenly the Jets, all the rumors were that the Jets were going to bring in somebody who was younger, somebody with less experience, and Glenn was going to take over the play calling. So we've gone from a situation where Glenn was going to be, and I hate to use the term CEO style coach because I think it's overused, but Glenn in year one was not somebody who was overly involved in the weeds of the defensive game planning. He wanted to be able to oversee everybody. And now we've gone from that almost overnight, because again, like this was not something the Jets said that they were setting out to do at the beginning of the offseason. Now overnight, Glenn's going to be super involved in the offense. Super involved in the defense. And he's apparently going to delegate a lot on the offensive side of the ball. There's a lot of buzz that the Jets are going to bring in an offensive coordinator who is very experienced, and that Glenn is essentially going to delegate everything to him. And again, like the quickness with which this has happened is confusing. The process for hiring a defensive coordinator to me is confusing. But what's most confusing of all is I think about where we were a year ago when the Jets hired Aaron Glenn. And beyond what he said, I think the biggest fan of this hire would admit that Aaron Glenn did not get this job because he was a brilliant defensive mind. Aaron Glenn did not get this job because he was a fantastic X's and O's tactician. Aaron Glenn got this job to be a culture builder. Aaron Glenn got this job because the Jets thought he would be the one that could turn the franchise around because of his leadership skills. If you look at what Glenn did in 2024 with the Detroit Lions, and it's easy to forget this now because of how miserable the 2025 season and how lost the Jets looked and how lost Glenn looked. But if you remember the job Glenn did in 2024, it was genuinely impressive. He took a defense that was just decimated by injuries, a defense that by the end of the year practically had no players and had them ranked 7th in scoring. It was a phenomenal job. And it wasn't because Glenn, out-schemed everybody on a weekly basis. In fact, as we discussed a lot in the show, a lot of his schemes are a little bit too old school. It was that Glenn set a tone where there was not going to be excuse making. Glenn set a tone where guys were expected to go in and produce. That's something that's been lacking around the Jets, to be honest with you. I think this Jets franchise has had a lot of issues over the last decade and a half. And one of the big ones is that there's just too much excuse making when things don't go right, that losing has become accepted. Glenn did not accept that in Detroit. Unfortunately, I think Glenn kind of lost that attitude when he got to the Jets a bit. But now Aaron Glenn's going to be the defensive mastermind who's going to turn this thing around. It just feels like we're kind of grasping at straws here. The Jets with these hires with the coordinators, they need guys who you hire them and suddenly everything feels different. And the challenge is that where the Jets are right now, those guys were going to be very difficult to convince to come here because the perception is that Glenn is on the hot seat. I guess you can argue that since Glenn's job is on the line, it's better for him to take on an active role on the side of the ball where he knows how to coach. But it just seems completely at 180 with everything we know about Aaron Glenn. I never thought that when the defense was in trouble that more Aaron Glenn was going to be the cure for it. There are some coaches you get because they're brilliant schemers. There are other coaches who need to hire good coordinators. Other coaches are there more for the leadership, big picture. If Glenn was going to work out, it always struck me that he would be the latter. That he was not going to be the guy who was the brilliant defensive, the brilliant defensive mastermind. But that's where we are right now, and part of it's probably just that where the Jets are right now, they could not land a higher caliber defensive coordinator, or at least a guy with a bigger resume. Again, I don't want to be too hard on the new hire, Brian Duker, but this was not a guy who anybody was expecting to be a defensive coordinator in the league in 2026, and now he is. I think it's in some ways a commentary on where the Jets are, and part of that's Aaron Glenn's fault, but it's not all Aaron Glenn's fault. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I have some thoughts on why the Jets keep struggling to find a head coach. A big part of it is that I just don't think this team puts their head coaches in position to succeed. I'll explain what I mean by that as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Rocket Money. Let's be real, managing your finances can feel overwhelming. Between subscriptions you forgot about, bills that keep going up, and trying to figure out where all of your money actually goes each month, it's easy to feel like you're losing control. And who has time to track every transaction or hunt down hidden fees? That's where Rocket Money comes in, the personal finance app that helps you take control. It finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. The automatic transaction categorization is a game changer. You can finally see exactly where your money is going each month. You can set budgets and goals, get personalized insights, and receive real-time alerts for large transactions, upcoming bills, and low balances. It even consolidates your checking, savings, loans, and investments into a single dashboard so you can get a clearer view of your entire financial picture. Let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/lockedon. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by TurboTax. Tax season does not have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax full service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert start to finish without the stress or guesswork. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They handle everything from W-2s to self-employment forms and work to get you every deduction. You can upload your documents, go about your day, and get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver and gives real peace of mind knowing an expert is handling it. And for a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert did not file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit turbotax.com/local to book your appointment today. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day, and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. If you have not already, go check out our new Everydayer Club. It includes access to an ad-free audio feed for Locked On Jets compatible with Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and every other major podcast app, along with an invite to the members-only Locked On Everydayer Club Discord server. Go to lockedonnyjets.supercast.com or tap the link in the show notes to learn more. On today's episode of Locked On Jets, we are talking about the New York Jets coaching staff, a situation where there is a lot up in the air, and there have been lots of questions about Aaron Glenn. I have asked many of those questions myself. I have not been impressed by the job Aaron Glenn has done during his one-year tenure with the New York Jets, and it feels like the deeper we get into this tenure, the worse it gets. The Jets, of course, lost 5 straight games to finish the season. All of the 5 losses were by 23-plus points. I don't think people realize how impossible it is to do that. In 2017, the Cleveland Browns went 0-16. This was at a point where there were only 16 games in the regular season. In those 16 games they lost, only one. This is a team that won 0 games all season. Only one of the losses the Cleveland Browns had in 2017 came by 23-plus points. The Jets lost 5 straight by 23-plus. I don't think people really conceptualize how bad the Jets were at the end of the season. And it's gotten worse since the season ended because Aaron Glenn has fired a bunch of coaches, and some of those moves were necessary. But when you fire both coordinators, when you fire the guy who's number 2 in command in offense, your passing game coordinator, and when you fire critical position coaches, you have to ask, why should we trust that the head coach is going to be able to hire the right people to replace them? Aaron Glenn's getting a lot of criticism, and I think he deserves it. But I also think that the Jets have done a poor job setting Glenn, or even coaches before Glenn, up to succeed. Of course, a lot of attention has been paid to the Seattle Seahawks, who are heading to the Super Bowl in a week to face the New England Patriots. And Seattle is quarterbacked by Sam Darnold, who began his career with the Jets. Darnold did not succeed with the Jets, and there's been a lot of attention paid to the way the Jets did not support him. There are lots of quarterbacks in this league who fail with their first team. And there's a big question in the league. Why don't teams do a better job developing quarterbacks? I think everybody agrees, though, at this point that quarterbacks do need to be developed, at least to some extent. I don't understand why we view head coaches as different. When you're a quarterback drafted into this league, it's a really hard job. You become, in many ways, one of the faces of the franchise. You are the most important player on the field, but you're facing enormous facing enormous challenges. You have a more complex playbook than you did in the past. You're facing more complex defenses. Um, everything is more difficult when you're a quarterback in this league. It's the toughest position to learn how to play. Well, head coach is the toughest coaching job there is, and you're doing things that when you're a head coach for the first time that you've never done before. You're also the face of the franchise. You have to speak to the media. You have to deal with player discipline issues. You're in charge of building the coaching staff. The coaches all report to you. If there are any disciplinary issues, you have to deal with them. And there's so many other things. I can't help but think about 2 long coaching tenures that just ended. The 2 longest coaching tenures in the NFL actually came to a conclusion over the last month. They were John Harbaugh with the Baltimore Ravens, who had been the head coach since 2008, and Mike Tomlin of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who had been the head coach since 2007. They were both first-time head coaches when they were hired, and both were kind of controversial hires because neither of them were viewed as top-tier candidates. Tomlin, in particular, was very young. Tomlin was in his mid-30s when the Steelers hired him. And I think about the jobs these organizations did helping these coaches to succeed. Tomlin's 2 coordinators were guys he inherited from Bill Cowher's coaching staff. He kept Dick LeBeau, who was a great defensive coordinator, in place, and he promoted a coach named Bruce Arians, who was the wide receivers coach under Cowher. He promoted him to offensive coordinator. Now, you may know, LeBeau is one of the great assistants of all time, one of the most brilliant defensive minds the league's ever seen. And Arians went on to be a Super Bowl winning coach in his own right. He had a very successful tenure with the Arizona Cardinals and then won the Super Bowl in 2020 with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And the Steelers had a stable front office. In Baltimore, Harbaugh stepped in and he was able to retain the defensive coordinator, Rex Ryan, who at the time was one of the top defensive minds in the league. And he had one of the best GMs in the league, Ozzie Newsome, to help provide him good players. These guys stepped into situations just like a quarterback needs a good offensive line and good receivers and a good play caller. Head coaches, when they first get the job, they don't really know how to do the job. They're hired based on their potential. They're hired based on the idea that they have ability as a coach, but they need to learn how to do the job. And a stable organization can help them grow. They can help them learn how to do the job. Now John Harbaugh's got his second job in the NFL as a head coach with the New York Giants. He's stepping into a franchise which has been in disarray. And you see that he's replacing guys, that he's overhauling a lot of aspects of that franchise. I don't think Harbaugh would have known how to do that in 2008. I don't think Harbaugh would have had as much knowledge as he does today. Now Harbaugh knows how to change a franchise. Harbaugh knows what a winning franchise should look like. Harbaugh's in a position where he can lead a good franchise because he learns. And just like a quarterback, may not be able to lead the team in year 1 or year 2. By the time a quarterback gets a few years into his career, he can carry more of the load. He kind of takes over the offense. He kind of becomes the guy who is the focal point in a way he isn't in his early years. In his early years, he kind of needs help. He needs the coaching staff and his teammates to help him out. The quarterback eventually takes on a bigger role. You look at the New York Jets right now. They're a team that's been down for a really long time. They don't have any of the pieces in place. And asking a rookie coach like Aaron Glenn to come in and fix everything. And Darren Woody Johnson referred to Darren Muji when Muji was hired as Glenn's sidekick. Essentially, Woody Johnson handed the control of the entire organization to Glenn without any sort of guide rails to help him out. It's a big task for a first-time head coach. And one of the things I've talked a lot on this show is that the Jets would be well advised to get a proven winner as a head coach, because if you don't have a good roster, you're better off with a veteran quarterback who understands how to set the protections, who understands how to work around a shaky offensive line, who understands where to find his outlets when he's under pressure, who understands how to throw guys open. If you put a rookie quarterback into a situation like that, he's going to struggle. Now, if you have a good offensive line, you have a good coaching, you have a good play caller, you have a good receiver group, then it's okay to play a rookie quarterback. I think if it's true for quarterbacks, it's also true of coaches. When you don't have the stable infrastructure within your franchise, when you don't have the top tier scouting department, the top tier GM, when you don't have coaches who can help as coordinators take on big roles, it makes it really hard for a first year head coach. And look, Aaron Glenn's got to own the job that he's done. The job he's done has been bad. It's been really bad. It's been one of the worst I've ever seen. But One of the issues is just that the Jets are not in a spot where you can really expect to develop a head coach the way more stable organizations can. And if you can't do that, you need to get the guy who knows what he's doing going forward. Well, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast. The Jets are still going forward with Glenn, though. They're not going to listen to my advice. And we now have 5 candidates for offensive coordinator openings. I got to be honest with you, I don't think many of them are exciting, but there is one clear favorite who has emerged. We'll discuss and break it all down, continuing here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Indeed. If you've ever hired someone who looked good on paper but was not the right fit, you know how important that is. When you want candidates who truly match what you're looking for, trust Indeed sponsored jobs. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs puts your post at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. If I needed to hire someone for this show, I'd go straight to Indeed and be very specific about what I need. Real experience, not just a resume buzzword. Instead of struggling to get your job post seen, Indeed sponsored jobs helps your listing stand out and reach quality candidates faster. Sponsored jobs boost your post to the people who are the best match for your role, and that makes a real difference because according to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. Spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. Listeners of this show get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Do it the right way with Indeed. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by Game Time. There's nothing like being in an NBA arena, the crowd, the energy, the moment. Getting tickets, though, that part has not always been so simple. That's why Game Time has become the go-to app for scoring tickets fast, without the hassle. It puts the advantage back where it belongs, with the fans. I don't just tell you about Game Time. I've used it myself on many occasions. I went to see the Jets play in London back in October with the ticket I got off Game Time. It was a great seat at a price I couldn't believe. I've used Game Time to go see shows on Broadway. I've used it to go see tennis at the US Open. I went to see the Holiday Bowl a few years ago. Every time I pulled it out at the last minute, I've been shocked by the deal I got. I also like that they give you the view from your seat. They give you a picture of what it's going to look like at your venue before you arrive. So no surprises, no obstructed views you weren't expecting. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. That's code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. And remember, it's gametime.co, not .com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We are talking about the Jets trying to fill out their coaching staff. There are lots of openings for this team. The first one was filled as the Jets finally found their defensive coordinator on Wednesday. Jets are looking for another coordinator, though. Earlier in the week, Tanner Engstrand and the team announced that they are parting ways. So the Jets announced on Wednesday that they have interviewed their first 5 candidates for the open offensive coordinator position. They are Darrell Bevell, Ronald Curry, Frank Reich, Greg Roman, and Lundo Wells. Lots of experience in that group. Lots of guys who have been around the NFL for quite a while. Bevell has worked with the Miami Dolphins the last couple of years. He's probably best known, though, for his work with the Seattle Seahawks. He was Russell Wilson's first offensive coordinator working under Pete Carroll. He was the offensive coordinator of the 2013 Super Bowl champions, and then was the offensive coordinator on the famous play a year later in the Super Bowl when the Seahawks were playing the Patriots the first time these teams met in the Super Bowl, and the Seahawks were on the verge of winning the game, and instead of handing the ball to Marshawn Lynch, they threw it. Now, in fairness to Bevell, in a situation like that, the head coach is usually the guy that's making the final call on the plays. But Bevell's a guy who's been around a really long time. So is Greg Roman, who's been the offensive coordinator of multiple teams in this league. He was, he's the offensive coordinator of San Francisco in the early Jim Harbaugh days. He was the offensive coordinator of the Baltimore Ravens in the early Lamar Jackson days. Most recently was the offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Chargers, was just fired by the Chargers. Another name, which is a name that's been thrown around a lot with the Jets recently, is Frank Reich, former head coach of the Indianapolis Colts and Carolina Panthers. The two names you might be less familiar with are Ronald Curry. I actually remember Ronald Curry as a player. He was with the Raiders for quite a while, And prior to that, he was a two-sport athlete at the University of North Carolina. He was a quarterback, but he also played point guard on the basketball team for a stretch. Ronald Curry's been he's been a coach in the NFL for over a decade now. He worked with San Francisco. He's then spent a long time with the New Orleans Saints. He worked his way up from offensive assistant to wide receivers coach to quarterbacks coach to finally passing game coordinator. In the last couple of years, he's been the quarterbacks coach of the Buffalo Bills. So now he's looking to step up into an offensive coordinator role. And the other candidate is Lunda Wells, who is the tight ends coach of the Dallas Cowboys. He's been in that role since 2020. Prior to that, he was the Giants tight end coach. And Lunda Wells has gotten a few other interviews for offensive coordinator positions. So this is a guy who's actually, I think, in some circles viewed as a rising star. It sounds like the smart money's on Frank Reich right now, though. That's been the name that's gotten a lot of buzz. And what I would say is that with the way things are shaking out right now, with the hire that the Jets made at defensive coordinator, and with Aaron Glenn taking over defensive play calling duties, I think it would be unlikely for the Jets to hire a first-time offensive coordinator because now Glenn's not really going to be overseeing the offense. He's going to have to delegate more. Not that Glenn was like super hands-on. I'm not saying like Aaron Glenn was the guy that was drawing up the game plans on offense. And I'm not saying, he was the guy calling the plays, but Glenn is clearly making a transition from the style of head coach, from a guy who was more overseeing everything to someone who's going to be focused on the defense. And a couple of reporters have used the phrase head coach of the offense to describe what Glenn's looking for. I don't think you'd bring in a first-time coordinator for that. So that would leave you with probably either Bevel, Reich, or Roman. Now, I would hope the Jets might find a way to bring Greg Roman in a role other than offensive coordinator. The reason I say that is Roman, in my view, is the best run game architect in the league. He draws up run plays better than any coach in the NFL. His issue is the passing game. His passing game is not that dynamic. The routes he draws up are not great, and his offense tends to get very stale very quickly. But if you could get a situation where you bring in Greg Roman and is not the offensive coordinator, and you use his mind to develop your run game playbook, maybe bringing Greg Roman as a run game coordinator, but you have somebody else calling pass plays. I mean, I think that would be a really dynamic thing for the Jets. One thing I would say, and look, I'm not endorsing the idea of bringing Justin Fields back, but Greg Roman on the team would be like the one scenario where I could even entertain the idea of Justin Fields returning for 2026 because I think Roman's the sort of coach is the only sort of coach that could get anything out of Fields, or at least get production to the point where you can actually feel decent about Fields playing quarterback. And for a lot of people, that's going to be a mark against Roman, I'm sure. But Roman's the sort of coach you need if you have a quarterback like Fields. I don't think I'd like him as the offensive coordinator, though. I think there are too many limitations. I think the ideal situation would be maybe a situation where Roman's brought in as at a lower level role, if that's possible. And I'm not sure it will be. But most of the smart money's on Reich right now. Reich is a longtime coach in this league, a guy who has had a long tenure, has had long tenures running offenses. Before he was the head coach, he was an offensive coordinator for a number of years with both the Eagles and the Chargers. I talked a bit about Reich on the show yesterday, and look, I think we need to be honest here. Frank Reich is not an elite offensive mind. This is not hiring Sean McVay to run your offense. This is not hiring Kyle Shanahan to run your offense. This is not hiring Ben Johnson to run your offense. I think for where the Jets are right now, for how undesirable this opening is right now, because you don't have a lot of talent on offense. You don't have a quarterback, and the coaching staff may be on the hot seat sooner rather than later. This is not a situation where you're going to be able to attract a top-notch candidate. I think a coach like Reich, who's had success in the past, and maybe his stock isn't super high right now, but you can make a case that maybe Reich's issues haven't been his fault. He was fired by the Colts in a year where they didn't really have a lot of talent on offense. They were this last year. They had Matt Ryan at quarterback at the end of Ryan's career. Then went to Carolina, which was a completely dysfunctional situation. That was Bryce Young's rookie year, and I think a lot of people around that team don't blame Reich. I think that's the best you could do if you're the Jets. And if you could get like Reich and Roman, I mean, I'm not saying it's great. I'm not saying that my confidence level is super high that Glenn's going to be able to turn things around with these guys, but of the situations you could have, that would probably be the best one that's realistic for the Jets at the moment. We'll see whether any other candidates emerge, though. I mean, certainly the defensive coordinator they hired came out of the blue, so it's always possible that somebody else emerges. Early in the defensive coordinator search, it sounded like Wink Martindale was going to be the guy, and the Jets went in a completely different direction. So, we don't know. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on a podcast, of give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoyed the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great Thursday, everybody. We're going to try again with the weekly mailbag. Jets keep making me push the mailbag back. We're supposed to do it Wednesday, then Engstrand got fired. We're supposed to do it today, then they hired their defensive coordinator. We're going to try once again on Friday if there's no big Jets news. Send in your questions. Talk to you then.